how can you do this not just in spite of your anxiety or your neurodivergency, but how do you integrate it? How do you actually invite that part of you up in like the front seat of your car? And it's kind of like, well, this is something I'm gonna lead with.
All right, let's kick off today's show. Today, we're talking with popular psychotherapist Joe Nucci about common mental health myths you might have seen online. Psychobabble is everywhere on social media with people self diagnosing and using psychological nonsense. Joe is a psychotherapist and writer who's researched the popular rise of psychology myths online and how they're impacting our health. He shares why trauma doesn't explain every bad habit you have, how therapy became a status symbol instead of treatment, the real reason everyone thinks their ex is narcissist, and why arguing isn't the same as being gaslit. Welcome to the show, Joe. It's great to have you.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's really cool to meet you guys.
As we were going through your book, I was laughing to myself about how many myths that I've believed over the years with the rise of psychobabble on social media. And we hear a lot of these from our clients and our coaching programs as well. But I think would be a great place to start with a definition of psychobabble and maybe what was the first psychobabble that started your journey?
My understanding of psychobabble, which is the title of my book, is it's basically employing psychological or mental health therapy related language to assert your position. The way I like to think about it is that for me, it's still kind of psychobabble, whether or not like you're using the terms accurately. And so even I'm guilty of some psychobabble if I'm using my knowledge to maybe better understand like a cultural event or like a political phenomenon or whatever it might be, because the point is you're using the field as a way to understand or explain your point of view, right? And so you can do this, I think, with good intentions accidentally, but I also think that a lot of people are using terms where they don't totally know what they mean, or they're just using them in a way where maybe they do know what they mean, but the emotions are feeling really high in whatever the argument is or the conflict is. And so it's just a way to kind of shut people down. What was my first experience of it? Well, I'm thinking about when I was in grad school and I was probably misusing terms all the time. um, I know that for med school students, and I've had friends who have gone to med school to be, like medical doctors, have reported this something called it's like I think it's med school student syndrome where they're learning about all these diseases and they kind of temporarily feel not that they're a hypochondriac, not that they're getting sick all the time, but it's like, oh, I already have this rare like underlying disease, but really they're just trying to organize all the distinctions. They have to let it settle. And I remember talking to a professor in grad school where I was like, I think am I on the bipolar spectrum? And she told me about med school syndrome and she was like, the more you learn about it, as soon as you start treating it and your internship, it's gonna go away. And so I think at the time, I was maybe thinking about bipolar in terms of just feeling intensely, like feeling like the high highs and the low lows, but that's not really what bipolar is. I think a lot of us feel very, very deeply, without it meeting any sort of pathological criteria.
Well, I think a big part of it too is we want an explanation, right? And a lot of times the
Totally.
psychobabble becomes an easier explanation for writing someone off or justifying our behavior or finding a part of our identity than it actually is. But that need for certainty drives a lot of it.
Listen, I totally get it. Like, I am a personality framework junkie. Like, I also want to learn like the next coolest distinction. Like, I am, even though I criticize it a lot, on my platform and of course in the book, like I am a therapist. Like, I'm a total psychology nerd. You know what I mean? And so I think that like the desire to more deeply understand yourself or others or a dynamic is totally understandable. I think that a lot of people will gravitate towards psychobabble when it's something that's just not entirely in our control. you know, um, Human beings, like, we need to feel like we have some control over what it is, and so I notice that psychobabble tends to get pretty bad whenever it comes to, like, relationships or parenting or even, like, work and, like, business outcomes, kind of financial success, and all of these things are things that are all very, very important to anyone who is listening and to any of us, and they're things that aren't always in our control because believe me, if I could control the outcome of all my relationships or my business, with psychology, I would, but I can't. I haven't quite cracked the code yet, I don't think.
Well, let's kick off with myth number one, because I'm sure a lot in our audience have heard this myth and we've discussed it in our coaching programs because it's so pervasive.
myth number one, everybody needs to go to therapy. I used to believe this myth. I have certainly repeated it before thinking about it more deeply. What I talk about in the book, I talk about two different patients. This was early in my clinical career, and one, she comes to therapy and she was like maybe a little anxious, but overall the work we did together was kind of we self-actualized, we became more self-aware. And I think by the end of that process, she was a less self-conscious person, and a little bit more integrated, we might say, from an analytic perspective. Um, and then there's this other patient I described, they were like, it was something like an hour late to a 45-minute appointment. And it was because they were emotionally dysregulated. They were had all sorts of cognitive deficits. There was a whole care team, myself included. They needed to fix their meds. We needed to reconceptualize the diagnosis. There was all sorts of basic lifestyle stuff around sleep and food that those needs weren't getting met properly. My argument is that the latter case example that I described, that person really needed therapy. Like that person needed like a counselor or a social worker on their side, piecing everything together, coordinating with the medical doctor, with the psychiatrist, with other resources because they were not doing well, and they greatly improved over the course of treatment. I'm not sure it's fair to say that the former example, where someone kind of knows themselves a little bit better, w- while she certainly benefited from therapy, and while anyone can hope to benefit from it, I think that's very different from a need. Something I don't talk about in the book, but that I've been very present to recently, is if you think about pre-pandemic estimates on mental illness, NAMI, it's the National Association for Mental Illness, I think is the acronym. Um, the generally accepted statistic was about 1 in 4 people had a diagnosable mental illness. So this is like your fitting DSM criteria. And so in a population of approximately 330 million, I think the US is, that's somewhere around 80 million people. And if there's about 700-ish therapists, 700,000 therapists, and we're all seeing 40 people a week, which is way more than I see, by the way, and more than I think a lot of practitioners see. But let's just say, just for the simplicity, you know, what is that? That's like 20 or 30 million people getting treated every week. Well, that's another 50 million people going without care. And what I think is happening is and I think most practitioners would agree with this, is that unless you are specifically following your personal ethical code and then the ethical code of your license, whatever that profession may be, and you're really working to make your treatment accessible for certain people, all of the clinical resources are getting funneled right to the top. And what I think you're often seeing, and I'll be honest, I am guilty of this. If it comes between a case that's going to pay me, my hundreds of dollars fee. I live in Manhattan, it's inflated here, and they're really easy, quote unquote, to work with. Like, of course that's a greater temptation than working with someone who has a serious mental illness or something like that. And so I think that when people propagate this myth, even though I think it's well meaning and I think it's meant to lower stigma, and anyone who's listening to this, if you're curious if therapy is a fit for you, like, you should go for a consult. I'm not trying to like moralize it or make it seem like people shouldn't go, but I think that we have to, if we're going to posture this like it's such a moral claim, right? Like everybody needs it. I think we should think about what the practical consequences of that are.
Well, certainly, talking does have its therapeutic results. We all know that, and of course, great relationships allow you to do that. You don't need to have a therapist when you have great relationships for a lot of the things that are concerning for you. Uh, but a bigger picture of that, and we see this in the medical field, which is big pharma, and we see it with the opioid crisis, where doctors were given bonuses for prescriptions, and you can't look at something that has been caught up in legal one time and think, well, that's just that field. No, it's not. It's pervasive. People are always looking for a cheap route. People are will always look for ways to get more money, and so
Mhm.
it is incredibly important, again, to get in touch with yourself, to learn about yourself, to define and identify who it is that you are, and then being grounded so that you know when you're off your mark and things aren't right, and how to get back to where you're feeling great. If you're not grounded, if you don't have an identity, then anyone can use any psychobabble to confuse you even more.
This is one of the reasons too. I'm very like pro coach. I'm very pro coaching industry. Like I said, there's just like the market supply and demand, like practicality of it. But I've encountered, personally as like a patient, some therapists that I think, maybe needed to to go get some more training. I didn't think they were the best. And I've encountered coaches that were absolutely changed my life and helps me understand my identity and who I am and how I should grow. And the inverse, right? I've talked to some coaches where I'm like, dude, you should not be helping people. Like, what is,
Yeah.
and maybe it's just as simple as it wasn't a good fit. And then obviously there's some therapists out there that are really great. So all that to say is I think there's so many ways to go about that outside of therapy that I think it's okay to talk about that, particularly as a mental health professional, because like I said, we're not running short on patients here. If anything, we need some help.
A point to the myth that you make that I think is so valid is the status that's often tied to going to therapy. That the act of seeing a therapist, I'm seeing a therapist, you need to see a therapist, absolves you of behaviors, assumes that you're working on changing. When anyone can pay a therapist and show up, it doesn't actually mean that you're doing the work, and it doesn't make you more valid in handling your issues than someone who's not. And we've now seen this rise in romantic contexts where partners are demanding that the person they date be seeing a therapist,
Mm.
regardless of any diagnosis being there. Like, I can't date you because you're not in therapy, because of this myth that everyone needs therapy.
The badge of honor that it now kind of symbolizes for a lot of people. It's just such an unprecedented transformation. I mean, I received therapy when I was younger after my dad passed, and it was acceptable because people knew what had happened with me and my dad, but it wasn't something that we like talked about, let alone put on a dating profile. You know what I mean? Like on a dating app. And so it's really interesting to reflect on. I think that if if the relational dysfunction you're having in your dating life or in your current relationship is connected to a mental illness, right? Maybe it's your ADHD, maybe you have bouts of depression or whatever it might be, or if it's connected to like my therapy has certainly helped me, like in my dating, like understand how the loss of my dad has like affected me, etc. Of course, I think all of that is very appropriate, but I say this to all the therapists listening out there with love, but it's like, have you talked to the therapist in your life about their like personal relationships and like dating life? Like when did we become like the sages on intimacy? And I sometimes look at what is out there on social media, especially, but just anywhere online. And I think I'd love to know what you two think about this, but sometimes I think it's like there's this idea. It's like, well, the spark is unhealthy. It must be very slow. It must be like super, like a lot of emotional intimacy, like a lot of secret share. And I'm like, that I think makes sense for some people, but I think some people they need a little bit more stimulation in their personal relationships. They need a little bit more excitement. Maybe their relationship is a site for, pleasure and passion, and they have, like really close friendships. You know what I mean? Like we all like look for different things. And I think that one of the things that I'm concerned about is there's this weird, like standardization of like what intimacy is supposed to look like for people. But as a trained couples therapist, intimacy looks pretty different for different couples in terms of what they're looking for and what they want.
What's been fascinating to me is, encountering those in my life and certainly our clients who find themselves perpetually single, who their actual most important relationship has become the intimacy they have with their therapist. And it's not necessarily around the work that they're doing, but it's around the ability to just have this open dialogue, as Johnny was sharing, where they can come in, they can share everything that's going on. It's sort of replaced a lot of the social and romantic intimacy because you can just pay the therapist to show up and help you with that intimacy that you're lacking in these other relationships.
Before we had all of this technology and before our laws and things have gotten completely out of control, we have survived. We are here. We're talking right
Yes.
now. We're not talking right now because we had this technology. We're talking right now because people understood how to get along, how to talk to each other, how to date, how to be in relationships with each other till death do us part. Now, you. yes, I'm sure we can make arguments of, was that the best for everybody? Probably not. But it was enough for civilization to thrive and for us to have all this great technology now. So rather than, how do we replace what we're missing with more technology? Well, why don't we go back to when there wasn't this technology and what people needed to do to learn about each other?
One of my favorite psychological thinkers, and it's a book I cite in my book, is a book called The Art of Loving by Eric Fromm. Are either of you two familiar?
I am, yes.
One of the things that blew me away about it the first time I read it was he talks about all these problems in dating and relationships and love and sex, and it's so articulate and it's just so beautifully written, and you feel like he is speaking exactly to your struggles. And then you find out he published it in like the 40s or 50s or something.
Still
This
relevant.
is pre-sexual revolution. I mean, pre-civil rights, like pre-internet, pre-dating apps. And so I think too, like a lot of times we want to like, blame, like I completely agree with you, Johnny. I think sometimes we want to kind of blame like the struggles that all of these different dynamics have had for pretty much everyone throughout history on our modern paradigm. And it's not that dating apps and the internet and certain things don't affect us uniquely, but there's this very clear through line, that everyone has had to figure out.
What I hate to see is this need for people who are relatively healthy, who are self-development junkies, to then seek out therapy as a gateway to getting more dates or replacing just actual intimacy in your life.
One of the myths I talk about in the book, like is more intimacy always better? You mentioned earlier that for some people, the most intimate relationship they have is with their therapist. And I think depending on the type of intimacy, I actually think that might be okay. Um, the ability to talk out loud with your therapist about whether or not you want to leave your current relationship. I'm not totally sure that's necessarily something you need to dialogue out with your current partner unless it's, you're actually considering like terminating the relationship. I think it's okay to be able to be super transparent about like trauma or abuse that happened to you, right? Maybe that's not something you want your partner to know. And that's actually like okay. I don't know if your partner needs to know every detail for them to be like the ideal partner for you. There's different types of intimacy. I do think it is a problem though, and I do agree that if the only intimacy you're getting is with your therapist, I'm wondering if the therapist is moving you to a place where you can have that with other people, because I would say that's the ethical way to conduct yourself as a shrink, or if there's maybe something more kind of more codependent and more kind of psychologically comfortable going on for the both of you, where it feels really good, right, to be this close to you, but I don't know if you're growing.
When you're perpetually single, you don't have a driver to be better for your children or your partner. Right? You have a need, a will to be better for yourself. It's a selfish will. When you're in a committed relationship, you want to be better for your partner. So you're looking for ways to be better in that relationship. You want to be a better father. So you're looking for ways to improve yourself, to be a better man, to lead your family. I will never forget, AJ and I were doing an interview, and I can't remember the girl's name, but we'll leave it out anyway so she doesn't get any hate. But her book was about breakups. And she was complaining about her parents who are still married and who fight all the time. And I'm like, you're writing books about breakups, but yet your parents had children and are still together, and you're arguing that they would be better to have been broken up. You got to live in a two-parent household growing up. It doesn't matter how much they might have fought. They found a way to make it work. You haven't.
I come from Spanish and Italian descent. Like we fight, we
Yeah.
yell. And I think a lot of people, I think it's Esther Perel, right? I think one of her viral sound bites I've seen, it's like fighting. Oh, it's necessary. You don't want to like burn yourself out. You don't want it to be all the time, but like you want to be honest. You want to be able to talk about it.
Well, you can't serve two masters. When you have children and a wife, right, you're serving them. You're getting better for them. You're looking for ways to improve yourself for them. When it's just for yourself, what are you maxing out? Your looks, your hedonism, your money.
Well, this leads to another myth in the book that I think, again, going back to the psychobabble that we've all encountered online, is that everyone has trauma. And I feel like this word has just shifted its definition to a place now where it's acceptable to say any interaction or thing that didn't go your way might be labeled as traumatic to you.
It wasn't something that I expected to be, kind of a figurehead for in my field. I that first video on this topic I posted, it wasn't, scripted out. It was just kind of like an off the cuff rant, and then we threw it up there, and it resonated with so many people, and since then I've thought so deeply about it. I've read so many more books that agree with me, books that disagree, and what I think most people agree on, regardless of their school of thought on whether or not everyone has trauma is not a thing that happened to you. It is your present moment's relationship to your past. And so in a similar way that there's like a stressor that can happen to you, like you get a scary email from your boss, right? Or a concerning text from the person you're dating. That is the stressor. But the thing that's happening for you psychologically and physiologically, that is your stress response. So in a similar way, lots of bad things happen to us, right? Lots of tragedies, lots of losses, accidents, harm, abuse, all sorts of things happen to us. But the trauma response, I think, is something that we need to classify with an operational definition that's a little bit more sacred. Some therapists, both on and some of them have platforms, some of them don't. They believe that anything that happens to you that results in a pattern of behavior that isn't good for you, um, is a trauma. And for me, I have a fundamental philosophical disagreement with that because we are shaped by the bad things that happen to us, but we're also shaped by the good things that happen to us. And sometimes the way we're shaped by the good things that happen to us, we may enter a period of life where that pattern is now maladaptive, and maybe we need some help changing that pattern or learning and growing, but that doesn't necessarily make it trauma based or trauma informed. And, earlier we were talking about, the pharmaceutical industry. I think, well, it's like, well, who benefits the most if everyone has trauma? You know, I don't think it's culture. I don't think it's public discourse, it might be therapists, right? Who want people to keep coming in. And so number one, trauma is at your present moment's relation to what happened to you. Two people get into a car accident. One has PTSD, one doesn't. Um, Number two, just because trauma is subjective and what is traumatizing to one person may vary, that doesn't mean that any response you're having is a trauma response, because I think that some responses are responses of grief, right? Or disappointment or stubbornness, right? Like I've remained in patterns in myself that maybe weren't necessarily good for me, not because of trauma, but because I'm stubborn, and proud. I don't necessarily think that's trauma informed.
Yeah, it's such a great point that what is labeled as maladaptive behaviors often in a short enough timeline might be helpful. But if we zoom out and then use the traditional labeling of it, say, okay, well, that's maladaptive, therefore it's trauma, it puts trauma at such a base level that, of course, everyone walking on the planet has it. But is it really the trauma that we're talking about that requires you seeing a therapist and getting some actual help? Or is that just living life, like being a human?
Something I write about in the book is I think it's so important we talk about how we talk about these things and why it's so great to be talking to you too and having these conversations with so many people, because I think that if we want to move mental health culture in a healthy direction, I think it would be great if the typical person understood, that emotional regulation during a trauma response is, just as valid as like an insulin shot for diabetes. But what seems to be happening is that people invoke it as a way to not have hard conversations, to not change and grow, to avoid responsibility. And I think that it's really, really tough because no one wants to be the asshole that's kind of like, no, like this is like a trauma response, like you have to fix. Like when someone's in pain, we're empathetic creatures. Like we want to like validate that. And I'm not even saying that we shouldn't do that, but it's so much if we're gonna destigmatize mental health and um, kind of bring the whole public into these conversations that my field has been having long since before I entered it. I think that we have to be telling them all the things, not just the things that are comfortable.
Going along with that idea of, trauma, using trauma as a way to absolve you of actually working on improving or managing the situation, it goes along with myth number 9, this your diagnosis is your identity, where we've started
Oh,
to
yeah.
to build an ethos around, like, just get the diagnosis, and then now we can use that in every context to say, "Oh, I just have ADHD. That's why I'm treating you poorly," or, "Hey, I have ADHD. That's why I can't get my job done." And not actually do the work to actually deal with the mental illness.
This goes back to something we were saying at the beginning where it's like people wanna more deeply understand themselves, and I think that's a very, like, universal human, not just desire, but a need. Like, people need to understand themselves and they need language for it. When you make a diagnosis your identity, though, I think what you're missing is that as a practitioner, I use diagnosis as a framework to inform your treatment plan. So you either do not have the diagnosis anymore, or if the diagnosis is something that, quote unquote, cannot be fixed, like ADHD or autism or something like that. But it's like, but how do you integrate this understanding of how your nervous system works so you can live a more adaptive life, a more functional life? That's what diagnosis is for. And what's really interesting, I think, is that so many practitioners, both on and off social media, actually shirk the idea of diagnosis altogether. And yet we're kind of living in this moment where then people are actually like clinging to these labels. So it's a really funny conversation for me to have because on one hand, I don't diagnose a ton in my practice. I don't need to. I don't accept insurance. If you accept insurance, you're getting diagnosed with something. Like you have an F code. So there's also that conversation where it's like this is for insurance companies and bills and all this like criteria, right? But I think that for me, the best part about getting diagnosed with ADHD, which I am diagnosed with, is that I now live a life where when I told some of my colleagues that I have it before I started making videos about it, a lot of them were like, "You do?" And it was like, "Yeah, I do." And it is hard sometimes. I have to manage it. I have to have responsibility for it. But I think the evidence that the therapy worked is that it's not super quote unquote like obvious. It's not completely running my life. I am running it. Right. And so particularly young people. Did you catch this trend? This was maybe over COVID or just after, but people on TikTok were pretending to have diagnoses, building massive followings, and then letting everyone know it's like, oh, just kidding. Like that was completely made up.
When you look at the need at that age to find identity, the desire to seek out identity, then of course, once you feel like you have a handle on your identity that a diagnosis may feel like it gives you, then you want to find other people who are just like you, right? And that platform with its algorithm is exactly that. It's finding people that you resonate with, as obscure as their viewpoint may be. The algorithm is working to get you hooked to that similarity, and it's going to continue to show you more of that. I think the deception around that and wrapping your identity in that, and again, not managing it, if that's truly your diagnosis, like that's the real harm being done, not only to yourself, but to everyone else you're in a relationship with.
Well, there's a little bit more that goes along with that as well. Is we certainly know that these um, social media and these apps encourage behavior that's not very productive or helpful. And with TikTok, it's incredibly easy to build an audience when you're getting sympathy likes and follows, and that is rampant. In fact, it's encouraged. There is many videos talking about how to build an audience, and it is exploit whatever weakness you have for sympathy. And and of course, if that's how people know you, and you build a following, and people like, what isn't an identity now becomes an identity, because that's how millions of people might see you when your friends are like, "Oh, that's just Jeff. He's normal." But I have a million people who think I'm, name this week's ailment.
I agree with everything you're saying, but I do wanna add we're talking about this from, like, the individual level, and we can, maybe have sympathy for the teenager that's, like, experimenting with identities and trying to figure themselves out, and we can criticize the person that is, maybe intentionally kind of brand building off of, like, a flaw or an imperfection, and then normalizing it and glorifying it. But I think the mental health field also has some responsibility here because before self-help became trendy on social media, we started expanding definitions around mental illness. So, for example, I think it was when the DSM-3 became 4, I wanna say, they completely reorganized all the criteria for autism spectrum disorder.
Mhm.
And now this word is a term. Like I saw Bill Gates gave an interview where he was like, well, I would probably be diagnosed with that. And, like Elon Musk, is on the spectrum. So it fits these two incredibly, regardless of what you think of them, incredibly smart and powerful and successful people. But then it also is a word that applies to people that actually need disability accommodations to keep a job. Like, is that inclusivity? Right? Or is this complete incoherence, designed to, kind of disguised as psychobabble, right? Like it sounds very convincing, but it's not. My understanding is the reason it got expanded is that people at the APA wanted to be able to cover more people because, you know, maybe, someone like a Bill Gates or Elon Musk could actually benefit from a little bit of therapy and learning about their nervous system. And I think that's absolutely great. But then when you let it bleed into the cultural conversation, now this one word means so many things. um, and so I think that's something that's important for us to keep in mind. I think it's easy to just blame individuals when we're talking about psychobabble for just like the misuse, or they're just trying to do an appeal to authority, but also the way psychologists and mental health professionals have used terms like depression or anxiety. I don't know if you're familiar with Nick Haslam. I think he's a researcher based out of Australia. He's found that it's not just that we use these words interchangeably, depression and anxiety, with like nervousness and sadness. It's actually like, well, that's actually how we've expanded the definition in some of the literature. And it's important to call out because the more the psychobabble gets into the scientific literature, and it's already there, to be clear, it's just going to become more incoherent and actually not helpful, and that's not
Right.
good. I mean, once you throw out the any scientific validity the field has, I think most people will agree that that's not a good thing.
Your myth 14, awkward has now become neurodivergent, is this exact expansion that we're talking about. Where, yeah, there are moments where I might appear awkward and my social anxiety might get the best of me, but that doesn't then make me autistic. And we've started to borrow this label and bring it into just normal occurrences of just being human, where, hey, it was overwhelming to be in such a large room of people you didn't know. You felt awkward, and now, oh, well, my friend is neurodivergent because that's the new term that's become popularized that sounds a lot better than autistic.
It's also a diagnosis that is more readily attached to identity, because if you are correctly diagnosed with something on the autism spectrum, like that's it does tell you a little bit more about who you are and how you work. It's a neurodevelopmental condition. And I use the word condition because even though it's classified as like a disorder in the DSM, I'm not necessarily sure that's true if it's not leading to um, disordered function or actually like impacting you in your life. And I think that regardless of if it's something like anxiety that can be cured, or something like autism, I don't think that the way to support your friend is socially awkward is to then say like, oh, that's okay, like, don't speak up, like don't go talk to that person that you like don't do that, like be comfortable. It's actually, I think the way forward is like, well, how can you do this not just in spite of your anxiety or your neurodivergency, but how do you integrate it? How do you actually invite that part of you up in like the front seat of your car? And it's kind of like, well, this is something I'm gonna lead with. If someone is flirting with me that likes me, and they own that they're awkward, or they're like, frankly, like I am on the spectrum, and so like I can't tell whether you like me back. Like, please tell me. Like, there's actually something like great about just like owning it, and pushing forward anyways as best you can, versus not engaging in life, right? Or just kind of staying comfortable and staying in the background.
It feels better in the moment to seek the certainty of the diagnosis than to actually just deal with the awkwardness that you might be feeling in passing. So the uncertainty tied to it will often lead us to seek out the diagnosis, even if it's not there, because it allows us to feel better knowing, okay, well, I'm just neurodivergent. That's why I feel awkward in these situations. Not that I'm actually doing anything about it to live the life that I want.
Listen, if your diagnosis is accurate, that is usually a great comfort to people in therapy, because it lets them name it. It lets them embark on what is hopefully a successful treatment plan. Um, and it lets them be able to kind of explain to themselves and others, like, why they feel like they've been messing up, or why they haven't been able to accomplish the goals that they value. And so I think that like a lot of therapists are anti-diagnosis. Like I said, I'm not. I think diagnosis can be really great if it's accurate, but it's the start of the journey. It's not the destination.
What has inflamed a lot of this when it comes to personal relationships and what we do around helping those in their life have a more vibrant social life and develop better relationships in their life, unfortunately, is we've increased the number in psychobabble of calling people sociopaths or calling people narcissists. And there's this new app, T, where we can go and label men as having these characteristics as never date them and write them off. And
Wait,
they're
I'm
a
sorry, what is
sociopath.
this? I missed this one.
So there's a new app called T where women can anonymously write about these exact things that we're talking about, that this person's neurodivergent or this person's a sociopath or this person's a narcissist. And other women can use the app as they're going around online dating profiles and say, okay, well, if enough women said this man's a narcissist, then I will avoid dating him. So it's a way for women to protect themselves. And I think at its core, it has a great desire to be beneficial in this dating marketplace. But unfortunately, with the rise of psychobabble, everyone's ex is a narcissist now. And everyone who's wronged you is a sociopath. And once we start throwing these labels around, we're actually doing real harm to people having great relationships in their life, having success romantically, having success in their social life. And I have no doubt that in certain instances, you probably did encounter a narcissist or you probably did encounter a sociopath or a psychopath. But the myth that everyone who's wronged you is this, or everyone who's shown that behavior in that situation is really detrimental to building healthy relationships in your life.
That's very interesting that this has become an app. In a perfect world, the app would just be used to warn people of the very real narcissists and psychopaths that are out there on the dating market for people to avoid. Um, However, it is my understanding and both personal and clinical experience with these populations that if they catch wind that they're on this app, that would actually be very scary. I'm thinking of the narcissistic and psychopathic like people I've encountered in my life. I just wouldn't want to have my name associated with some sort of like a posting or a story in which they could identify me because, if we're talking about the personality disorder, right? They can be vicious. They can be super, super scary. So my first thought is like, are these women okay? Like, you know what I mean? Like,
Right.
because it's not even, I mean, I want to talk about how maybe they're misusing it in a second, but my first thought is, oh my God, that's not even like the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario for me is like, oh, this is like an accurate assessment of who this person is. And, and they catch wind and they want revenge. I mean, particularly someone who's narcissistic is going to be fairly reputation conscious, you know?
Absolutely.
Um, and so that's number one. Number two is, look, I mean, we all learned it when we watched Mean Girls, right? Like people, men do this too, but women will use reputational harm as a way to um, advance their own personal agendas. It's just something that happens, for better or for worse. And so with the with the term being so watered down, what I write about in the book, and what I hope to kind of normalize about the narcissism conversation is that a lot of psychologists, a lot of therapists, a lot of writers on this subject actually believe that it's a spectrum and that it is actually okay, even healthy, to have some narcissistic traits. People in media, in our profession, you know, like admiration, like to feel like we're associating with important people. Like, is that narcissistic? Right? It's in the symptom cluster, depending on how loosely you want to define it. Um, a lot of people who are surgeons tend to be more narcissistic, but you know what? If you're going to be cutting into my brain because I have a tumor, I want you to have a little bit of a God complex. I want you to have like a little something to prove, our leaders. And so I don't think it's necessarily a net negative trait. There's a difference between liking admiration and then being drawn to maybe like a career that will give that to you. And like when you don't have it, like you're so fragile that like you go into a complete meltdown, right? There's a really, really big difference there.
In processing breakups and processing things that you perceived as someone wronging you, emotions are high. And it's very easy for you to default to your perspective on that. And with the negative emotions that you're feeling towards that other person, to reach for, again, that certainty of this person was the sociopath and this person was the narcissist and what they did to me, when maybe the other person is nowhere near that. But in that particular situation and the way that things unfolded, it may have appeared that way. But you labeling that with no actual medical background, no understanding of what an actual narcissist is, we've watered this down as a label to write people out of our lives, whether that's on an online dating app called T, where it's write these men out of our lives, whether it's to explain away those first dates that were awkward or weren't fun or comfortable or what we were looking for. And unfortunately, it does carry reputational harm. And it also keeps you from having healthy relationships when you're constantly looking out for the narcissists and the sociopaths, when the numbers are there that they're not as apparent as we like to believe based on social media. There's just not that many psychopaths and narcissists walking around damaging people.
Are you too familiar with, like, the distinction of vulnerable narcissist?
No, I'm not.
It's the idea that, the kind of classic manifestation of narcissism is someone who's, like, very grandiose, kinda like hoity-toity, like, "I'm better than you, I'm superior." Um, but there's another way to kind of play that superiority game, and one way is to do that through, like, essentially victimhood. You know? And so it's kind of like, everyone else is so horrible and awful, like poor me. And I do wonder, and it's and it is a question that a lot of people have, whether or not they are therapists or work in the field. All these people that can't stop talking about it. They can't stop talking about narcissism, that have dated like 2 dozen of them. Like, at a certain point, there is a common denominator, you know? Um, how I work with patients, if the topic comes up that maybe they're dating someone narcissistic, I do a few things. I say, like, "Yeah, maybe they actually do have sprinkles of narcissism in their personality, but is it, like, the main flavor of the soup?" Right? Or is it a sprinkle? And if it's a sprinkle, is it helpful to think about it in terms of narcissism, or can we say they are immature, selfish, avoidant? When they're relationally stressed, do they get grandiose? So this is something else I talk about in the book. Some people get very insecure when they're relationally stressed. Some people kind of, like, the narrative is like let's say like you and I are dating and then things are going a little south. My mind might go to, oh, like, I'm never gonna find love, like, I'm not lovable, I can't do anything right, like, what's wrong with me, right? It's a very normal reaction. Then there's this other side of the coin, which is just kind of like, well, AJ's a jerk. You know what I mean? Like, I'm basically, like, the best thing that could have ever happened to him. Like, does he not know how lucky he is, to have dated someone like me? And that sounds very narcissistic, but I mean, come on, I think, like, most people have had moments like that, right? When they're stressed and they're in the heat of the moment and they're just trying to sort it, and maybe they communicated that in the fight, because in fights, we often say things to hurt the other person or to win the argument. I'm not endorsing that, I'm just saying it's something people do, and I don't think that's indicative of having a narcissistic personality at all.
That was my point exactly, that a lot of these situations around a breakup or things not going the way you would like in a romantic context, to then turn that into labeling, diagnosing that person as behaving that way in every scenario in their life, and therefore writing them out off as someone that should be dateable, causes real relationship harm to you, to be constantly looking for that, and to the other person who's now labeled as that. And if it's on an app, it's even worse that they're now labeled, and potential other partners who might be a better fit for them see them as that diagnosis and avoid them completely. So in the watering down, this label being thrown has actually, I think, made romantic relationships harder for all of us when we're all just trying to find that partner. And it's an unfortunate rise through social media that everyone now is using these labels of my ex is a narcissist or that person's a psychopath.
It also brings me back to what I mentioned earlier, one of my kind of concerns that I've been thinking about lately, um, is this, like, are we trying to, like, standardize, like, what, like, a healthy relationship looks like in a very unhelpful way? I'm thinking about I remember talking to, like, it was like a friend at a party, based in the Bay Area, and, like, her whole vibe was like, "I'd only am gonna date like the hotshot CEO. Like I'm a beautiful, smart woman, and like this is who I want to date. But then as she was talking about, the different dating relationships she was having, they were always canceling on her because they're entrepreneurs. They're like their startup is their girlfriend, for lack of a better metaphor. And understandably, she's hurt by that and like wants to be prioritized by her partner. And this is something that every therapist is guilty of. And I felt bad because I really wasn't trying to trigger insight, but I remember we're like it's like over drinks or something, and I'm talking to her and I go, well, like, you can't, like, blame them for being exactly what you wanted them to be. Like, you want them to be, like, the hotshot CEO, like, they're gonna be working all the time. Like, that's gonna be, like, their whole thing, and you just I remember watching, like, the glass kind of shatter where she was like, "Oh, like, I have to, like is this actually what I want?" And I think a lot of people, find traits that we associate with narcissism, both malignant, bad, pathological narcissism, and also just, like, the healthy kind of sprinkles of it, is very attractive. Like a little arrogance is incredibly attractive. Success and ambition, right? Being so like having lots of, friends who they feel like are also successful. That's very, very attractive. And so if that's something that's going to be important to you in your partnership choice, like own that, okay. And when they're stressed, maybe they get a little bit grandiose, right? And is that dynamic within the parameters of something that you can deal with? Are they self-aware enough to also kind of keep it in check? Like, can you talk about it? I think that that's the much better route forward than saying, well, anyone who's even a little bit narcissistic or selfish, assuming you're even using the word correctly, is just a no-go. I think if people are being honest with themselves, then narcissists wouldn't nearly be getting all the men and women that they seem to be getting on the dating market.
Well, that brings me to one of the other myths that I wanted to discuss because I've seen this rise in this term gaslighting across social
Mm.
media. And now it's just the perfect encapsulation of psychobabble in my mind that anytime we're in disagreement, someone is gaslighting you.
I want you both to listen to this and anyone who's listening or watching this to remember this if they don't remember anything else about gaslighting. It's not something that can happen in a single conversation. Even like Dr. Ramani or all these other creators who have very like prolific platforms that I would say don't necessarily agree with me, like on kind of my philosophy on how to understand narcissism and stuff. Even they will agree that gaslighting is a grooming process. It happens over time. And so whenever somebody is in an argument and somebody is disagreeing with them or remembers something differently, while that may be difficult in the moment, it's not gaslighting. And if someone's remembers something different from you, well, the memory researchers can only agree on one thing, and that's that memory is super unreliable. You know, um, even like being on podcasts, like I'll go back and listen to the episode. I was like, wow, I don't even remember saying that. That's great that I said that. But it's just we really don't remember. Um, and so it's my favorite definition of psychobabble because if you actually go to Merriam-Webster dictionary, it was their word of the year in 2022. But what's fascinating is they actually have two entries for it. I write about this in the book. They have the more kind of I would say correct definition where it's like this is a process of psychological abuse and coercive control where you over time get the person, the victim, the survivor of it to doubt their own perceptions. Um, and then there's this other definition which basically is amounts to like disagreeing. And I don't think that Merriam is trying to make all this psychobabble confusing. I think they're just reporting on how words are being used in the vernacular. And so for me, it is proof actually that this concept creep of these terms has gone quite far because those are two very different meanings, and people are kind of playing bait and switch with which one they're using depending on what kind of argument they're having.
It keeps you from any resolution because if you're now blaming someone as gaslighting you, you're espousing that they have malintent in the way that they're arguing with you.
Has anybody ever accused you, either of you, of gaslighting when you're just disagreeing or misremembering?
It hadn't happened for many years in my life until recently.
How do you 2 handle it? I have ideas on how to. I'm just curious how you've navigated it this far.
it actually allows me clarity that we're not going to be working towards a resolution. So continuing the
Fair
argument
enough.
with
Yeah,
you
yeah, yeah.
when you're throwing that accusation around means that you're not actually bringing empathy to the conversation. You're not trying to see my perspective. You're dismissing it as a tool for you to win the argument. So in my mind, it's like, great, I know who I'm arguing with. I'll back off. And unfortunately, when someone is saying you are gaslighting me, it doesn't leave much room for a resolution.
I think that is a perfectly appropriate and even strategic approach in a lot of cases. Um, what I might do if you feel like it would make sense in a given context is I would actually like in a weird way like go in and validate it, not to give them power in the argument, not even to like admit that like, oh, like you're right, I was gaslighting you. That's not what I mean by validate, but just like go in and it's like just communicate your understanding that it's like, "Oh my gosh," like, "and you felt X when I said Y because it's not how you remember, like, Z happening." Like, "I'm so sorry." Like, "You tell me, like, how you remember it." Like, just, like, go into that other mode because for me in my life, when the word has gotten brought up, I do that and one of 2 things happen, right? It kind of snaps them out of it and they realize that they just mean disagree, and then you can talk about the disagreement, or they double down. And if they're doubling down, then I think you actually have like extra proof. You can be extra sure that like this is actually a conversation or a working relationship that you need to consider exiting, right? Or at least until they're able to talk about it like adults, right? And I think that the idea that it's inherently harmful to influence each other with language. And that's gaslighting. It's like, well, then we all might as well just stop talking altogether. You know what I mean? Like, it's like that's how it works. I don't think that a parent you know, trying to keep parameters like on their rambunctious teenager. Like, does that count? Does that count as gaslighting? And I don't think it does. I think that we need to. I think it's better for that one to be pretty specific in how we're defining it, and also honoring. Like, I mean, I've treated survivors of gaslighting. It's brutal, man. Like, it is brutal what people like go through, and then getting them out of that is very patient work. It takes a really long time, and so I think that if people took the time to maybe like hear about some survivors of gaslighting and what they went through, I don't think they would be using it as a joke at a party or using it to describe like a figure in the media so flippantly because they would I think they would feel badly.
The end result of the actual definition of gaslighting is you losing insight into your own perception of reality, where you no longer trust yourself, whether it's with this person or then it branches out into all other relationships. And digging out of that outcome is tragic. It's an awful situation to be in where you're doubting your own eyes and ears and how you're perceiving reality because this person has not only in that interaction, but multiple interactions and oftentimes with other people in your life created this false sense of reality around you to coerce you and manipulate you. And that's why when I hear it charged towards me, I realize, well, there might not be a resolution to this disagreement, and you have a pretty strong stake in your viewpoint. So I'm not going to continue to fight my viewpoint. We can accept yours and move on.
I agree with what you're saying, and that being able to do that in itself is a psychological skill of in DBT they call it both and, right? Like how can you hold multiple perspectives at once, even paradoxical perspectives as true? And it's easy to understand. It's hard to do, but I believe that anybody can get there with practice, maybe even with little therapy, right? Or just, with just like support that I mean, growing up, my dad had this saying that was like, it's like, what are you gonna do? You're gonna live on an island by yourself? It's like you live in a society with people who are different from you, and they're gonna remember things differently and prioritize different things. And so figuring that out is I don't know, I think it's part of growing up and it's, it's tough, man, because, man, people are different, aren't they?
Well, we appreciate you dispelling some myths for us and our audience.
Yeah, of
Where
course.
can they find out more about the book and your work?
They go to joenuccitherapy.com for those who are listening. That's like Gucci with an N as in Nancy, Nucci. Joe Nucci Therapy. That's also my handles on social. I'm most active on Instagram. And my book, where I talk about a lot of these myths we discussed today, 40 of them in total, Psychobabble, Viral Mental Health Myths and the Truths That Will Set You Free, is um, out starting September 23rd, 2025.
Thank you for joining us, Joe.
Thanks.